All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling U.S. policy in Indochina,
Okay.
specifically Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia,
Oh.
from the 50s through the early 70s,
Hmm.
and our source, Noam Chomsky's For Reasons of State.
Yeah, I think folks might be thinking, oh, another Vietnam War deep dive, but
Right.
Chomsky really flips the script on the Cold War narrative.
Totally. And that's what we're here for, right? To
Mm.
dig into stuff that challenges how we think about things.
Exactly.
So to set the stage,
Mm.
we all know about the domino theory, right?
Right.
The fear that if one Southeast Asian nation falls to communism, the rest would follow like dominoes.
Yep, that was huge in shaping U.S. policy.
Big time.
Yeah.
But Chomsky's saying there's more to the story.
Oh, yeah, much more. He connects this domino theory to a bigger picture, like maintaining U.S. global economic dominance. He actually points to declassified documents from the National Security Council,
Oh, wow.
officials like Dean Acheson, even President Kennedy talking about Southeast Asia. They're saying it's strategically important.
So it wasn't just about containing communism.
No, it was about resources,
Uh-huh.
markets, keeping Japan from siding with communist powers.
Oh, so they saw Southeast Asia as this big economic and strategic chessboard.
Exactly, like a game with huge stakes, right? Chomsky even compares the U.S. and USSR,
Yeah.
saying both used security as this catch-all phrase to justify their actions.
Right.
But really, it was about advancing the interests of their own dominant social groups.
That's a good point. It makes you think about how often national security is used to just justify things that might not actually be about security at all.
Right.
But how did the U.S. justify intervention on the ground? Was it all just kind of smoke and mirrors?
Well, this is where Chomsky's analysis of aggression gets really interesting. He says the U.S. government totally manipulated the definition of aggression to fit their goals in Indochina.
So they changed the meaning to suit them.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
For example, after the Geneva Accords that supposedly divided Vietnam, you had South Vietnamese soldiers just returning to their homes in the South. The U.S. claimed this was an armed attack.
Wait, hold on. Going back home was an attack?
I know, right? It gets crazier.
Okay.
Chomsky talks about this idea of internal aggression, too.
Yeah.
Basically, any political activity that the U.S. didn't like, anything that opposed their goals, was suddenly labeled as aggression by foreign communist powers.
So basically, anyone who disagreed with the U.S. was a communist puppet.
Pretty much, yeah. And maybe even more troubling is that Chomsky highlights how the U.S. executive branch often just ignored its own legal obligations.
They just ignored the law.
Yeah, even the UN Charter, to push forward their agenda.
Wow.
His argument is that international law often bends to the will of the powerful.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. It makes you wonder who gets to define these big terms like aggression, freedom on a global scale.
Right. Who decides?
And as we'll see, this twisting of words had very real consequences for the people of Indochina.
Speaking of which, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the human cost of this war. Chomsky calls it this ethically neutral war, and he's being sarcastic, right?
Oh, totally. He's super critical of the Pentagon Papers, those top secret documents about the war.
Right.
He says they focused way too much on the cost to the U.S. and not enough on the impact on the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians.
I mean, that's understandable, in a way, to focus on your own people.
Yeah.
But to totally disregard the others is crazy.
Yeah, and Chomsky uses those same Pentagon Papers plus other sources to show the brutal reality of villages destroyed, civilian casualties, these massive refugee crises.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's really intense. The thing that gets me is the language some U.S. officials used when they talked about the consequences of the war.
What do you mean?
They'd talk about generating refugees like it's some kind of neutral policy choice.
Wow.
Detached from the human suffering.
Like moving pawns on a chessboard?
Exactly. Chomsky really contrasts that official narrative of defending freedom with the actual experiences of those on the ground.
Right, yeah. There's a huge disconnect.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's who are we really fighting for? What are we really defending? These are the questions Chomsky's forcing us to ask.
That's so important, though,
Yeah.
right? To question these official narratives and look at the real human impact of these events.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the people behind the statistics,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, Chomsky also introduces this idea of the other war. What is he talking about there?
He's talking about the pacification programs and how the U.S. tried to control the South Vietnamese population.
Okay.
So it wasn't just about fighting the Viet Cong. It was about winning over the hearts and minds of the people, but through some pretty brutal means.
So almost like a counterinsurgency strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What did that look like in practice?
Well, for example, there was this thing called the Strategic Hamlet Program.
Okay.
They basically forced peasants to relocate into these fortified villages, supposedly to protect them from the Viet Cong.
So really it was about control.
Totally disrupting their lives, cutting off their support for the Viet Cong, controlling their every move.
That sounds awful. Imagine having to leave your home, your farm, everything you know, just because someone says it's for your own safety.
It's a reminder that war isn't just about battles, it's about the destruction of societies, too.
Yeah, it's about people's lives.
And it wasn't just the hamlets, there was also the Phoenix program. This was a covert operation, super controversial, even back then.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Aimed at neutralizing the Viet Cong infrastructure, which basically meant assassinations, capturing people, often just based on suspicion.
Wow.
And Chomsky sees this as a prime example of how the U.S. was willing to just tear apart the social and political fabric of Vietnam to achieve its goals.
It's heavy stuff.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
Yeah.
This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Next time we'll dive into Chomsky's argument that the U.S. completely misunderstood Vietnamese nationalism. Like, they couldn't grasp why people would resist their help.
Can't wait to hear more about that.
It's wild. We'll unpack it all.
Okay, this is going to be good.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Noam Chomsky's For Reasons of State.
Yeah, we're picking up where we left off.
Right, with this idea that the U.S. totally missed the mark on Vietnamese nationalism.
Right. Chomsky really hammers this point home. He's basically saying the U.S. just couldn't understand why the Vietnamese people would resist their so-called help.
Yeah, it's like this whole savior complex.
Totally. He's got all these quotes from high-ranking U.S. officials who are just baffled by the Viet Cong's resilience and the popular support they had.
So instead of seeing the Viet Cong as like legitimate freedom fighters, the U.S. just saw them as pawns of communism.
Exactly. They couldn't grasp this idea that the Vietnamese people might actually want self-determination, like they might have their own reasons for resisting.
Yeah, it's almost like they couldn't conceive of people wanting something different from what the U.S. wanted for them.
It's a classic example of a powerful nation imposing its will on another without really understanding the local context, the history, the people's motivations.
It's like they were looking at the situation through these ideological blinders, unable to see the reality on the ground.
And this misunderstanding of Vietnamese nationalism directly ties into Chomsky's critique of how the U.S. handled elections in South Vietnam.
Right, the elections were supposed to be this key part of the peace process.
Exactly. But Chomsky argues that the U.S. actively undermined any chance of genuine democratic elections by excluding communists and neutralists.
So they were rigging the game from the start.
Pretty much. They wanted to ensure that a pro-U.S. government would stay in power, regardless of what the Vietnamese people actually wanted.
It's cynical, but not surprising when you think about it.
Yeah, it exposes this gap between the U.S. rhetoric about democracy and their actual actions. It wasn't about letting the Vietnamese people choose their own destiny. It was about maintaining U.S. control.
It makes you question how much of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War was truly about spreading democracy versus just containing communism and furthering their own interests.
Right, and Chomsky forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth.
So we've got this misunderstanding of Vietnamese nationalism, this manipulation of elections, and then you layer on top of that these brutal pacification programs, this other war that Chomsky talks about.
Right, the other war, the efforts to control the South Vietnamese population, it's a crucial part of his analysis.
Can you remind us what he means by that?
So it's not just about fighting the Viet Cong on the battlefield. It's about winning over the hearts and minds of the people, but often through really harsh means.
Right. We talked about the Strategic Hamlet program, uprooting people from their homes, trying to isolate them from the Viet Cong.
Exactly. But it went way beyond that. You had widespread psychological warfare, propaganda, terror tactics aimed at breaking the will of the people.
So it was this multifaceted campaign to control the population, to undermine their support for the Viet Cong.
And Chomsky argues that this other war was just as destructive, if not more so, than the conventional fighting, because it was aimed at dismantling Vietnamese society from within.
It's easy to get caught up in the big battles and the bombing campaigns. But this other war was happening in the shadows, often targeting civilians.
And one of the most controversial aspects of this was the Phoenix program.
Right, the Phoenix program, it was this covert operation, wasn't it?
Yeah, aimed at neutralizing the Viet Cong infrastructure, which often meant assassinations, torture, imprisonment.
It sounds incredibly brutal.
It was, and Chomsky argues that it was part of a deliberate strategy to create a climate of fear and repression. He provides evidence that the program was riddled with corruption, that innocent people were killed.
So it wasn't just about taking out specific targets, it was about terrorizing the population into submission.
Exactly. And this was all happening while the U.S. was presenting itself as a defender of freedom and democracy.
The irony is just staggering.
It's a stark example of the contradictions at the heart of U.S. foreign policy during this period.
So we've got this toxic mix of misunderstanding, manipulation, and brutality. And it's all happening against this backdrop of the Cold War, this ideological struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right, but Chomsky's pushing us to look beyond those simplistic narratives. He's asking us to grapple with the real motivations, the real consequences of U.S. actions.
And it's not a pretty picture.
It's not. But it's a story that needs to be told, and Chomsky tells it with unflinching honesty.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still one major piece of the puzzle we need to explore: the expansion of the war into Cambodia.
Right, Cambodia. That's where things get even more complicated.
And even more tragic, I imagine.
Definitely, Chomsky sees Cambodia as this prime example of the dangers of U.S. interventionism, how pursuing narrow strategic goals can lead to unintended consequences with devastating human costs.
So how does Cambodia fit into the broader narrative of U.S. involvement in Indochina?
Well, for starters, Chomsky argues that the U.S. played a key role in overthrowing Prince Sihanouk, the leader of Cambodia, in 1970.
So regime change, basically.
Yeah, and this led to a pro-U.S. government taking power and the expansion of the war into Cambodian territory.
It's like they couldn't contain the conflict. It just kept spilling over.
Yeah. And to understand the U.S. motivation here, we have to talk about the Nixon Doctrine.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that.
So it was this policy shift under President Nixon that emphasized relying on regional allies, covert operations, and air power to achieve U.S. objectives.
So basically trying to avoid another Vietnam in terms of ground troops, but still wanting to exert their influence.
Exactly. And Cambodia became a testing ground for this approach. The U.S. launched this massive bombing campaign against suspected communist sanctuaries in Cambodia, even though Cambodia was officially neutral.
So they were bombing a neutral country.
Yep, and Chomsky argues that this bombing campaign was absolutely devastating for the Cambodian people, killed thousands of civilians, created a huge refugee crisis, further destabilized the country.
It's incredible how one decision, one policy shift, can have these ripple effects that are so far-reaching and so destructive.
And that's a major theme in Chomsky's analysis. He sees this pattern of arrogance, short-sightedness, a willingness to use brute force, all in the name of fighting communism and advancing U.S. interests.
It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of these ideological battles.
Absolutely. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Chomsky connects all of this to the larger questions of war crimes and the limits of justifiable intervention.
Okay, this is heavy stuff, but I think it's important that we grapple with these questions.
I agree. It's not easy, but it's necessary if we want to learn from the past and build a better future.
Well said. All right, let's take a break and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to our deep dive into Chomsky's For Reasons of State. This has been pretty intense.
It has.
It's super fascinating, right? We've talked about domino theory, economic motivations, the human cost of the war, even the expansion into Cambodia. But I think now we need to talk about, like, the big questions.
Yeah, the big ones.
Was the U.S. intervention legal? Was it moral? What does it all mean for us today? I mean, those are the questions, right?
Those are the questions that Chomsky tackles head on. And he's not pulling any punches. He argues straight up that U.S. intervention in Indochina was not only morally wrong, but illegal under international law.
So he's not just saying it was a mistake. He's saying it was a crime.
That's exactly his argument. He goes point by point, dismantling the justifications the U.S. government gave, showing how they were twisting things to fit their narrative.
Like when they redefined aggression to justify their actions.
Exactly, yeah. He says the U.S. was manipulating language to make themselves look like the victim, like they were always acting in self-defense. But they were the ones using force over and over, breaking their agreements under the UN Charter.
And they were interfering in another country's internal affairs.
Right. Even if they claimed it was to defend freedom and democracy, Chomsky questions whether they had the right to do that in the first place.
You know, when you think about the millions of people who died, the societies that were destroyed, the lasting trauma, it's hard not to wonder if the U.S. really understood the consequences of their actions.
Chomsky argues they didn't. And he brings in the voices of the Vietnamese people, those who actually lived through the war, to show the real impact of those decisions.
Yeah, the human cost, the individual stories that get lost in the official narratives.
Right, those are the voices we need to hear, and that leads us to the question of war crimes.
Yeah.
Chomsky argues that the U.S. committed numerous war crimes in Indochina, things like the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, the use of Agent Orange.
It's easy to think of war crimes as something that only, like, rogue states or dictators do.
Yeah.
But Chomsky's saying even powerful democracies can be guilty of them.
He's challenging that idea that war crimes are only committed by the bad guys, you know?
Right, right.
He says the U.S., as a global power, should be held to an even higher standard. He even brings up the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were held accountable.
And he's making that comparison.
He's asking, shouldn't the same principles apply to those responsible for what happened in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia?
Wow, that's a tough question to answer.
It is, and it brings up all these issues of international justice, how we deal with the legacy of these conflicts.
Yeah, it's not just about the past. It's about how we move forward.
And Chomsky takes it a step further by looking at the moral dilemmas that people face when they believe their government is doing something wrong. He uses the example of the Berrigan's, those activists who destroyed draft records to protest the war.
Right, the Berrigan's. That was a huge deal.
It was, and their actions were super controversial. But it raises this question, what do you do when you believe the law is wrong? What are your obligations as a citizen?
It's about the tension between following the rules and standing up for what you believe in.
Exactly, and Chomsky argues that we have a moral obligation to speak out against injustice, even if it means breaking the law.
That's a powerful message, and I think it resonates with a lot of people today.
It does, because it's about taking responsibility. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping a more just world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chomsky's work, I think the big takeaway is that we need to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
We need to question the narratives we're given, especially when it comes to war and foreign policy.
Absolutely. We need to look at the evidence, listen to different perspectives, and be willing to challenge those in power.
And I think Chomsky gives us the tools to do that, right?
Yeah.
He provides this framework for understanding these complex issues, for seeing through the propaganda and the spin.
He does, and he reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates. It's a living story that we're all a part of.
And we have a responsibility to learn from it, to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
Exactly. That's the hope, right? That we can use this knowledge to create a better future.
Well said. All right, that's it for our deep dive into Noam Chomsky's For Reasons of State. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.